I'm Julie Barkey with this Senate update. On Wednesday, the Senate moved another finance bill, the Environment, Economic Development, and Agriculture bill. Senator David Tomassoni's legislation had a budget target that increased base level funding by $56 million over the biennium. Now, the debate centered around a $10 million grant to the state's Film and TV Board. Several amendments were offered that would either remove or modify the grant in some form.
Within the Senator Tomassoni's bill is an appropriation for the Minnesota Film and TV Board, and it was noted during Finance Committee that the recommendations of the legislative auditor had not been incorporated into the provisions when that bill was drafted. The report had not yet come out, so I appreciate Senator Goodman for rightly pointing that out. And this amendment directs the Minnesota Film and TV Board, in consultation with the Department of Employment and Economic Development, to develop grant agreements that include clear board duties and measurable goals, as well as eligibility criteria. The grant agreements developed must be submitted to the chairs and ranking minority members of the Senate and House of Representative committees by September 15th, 2015. And then, in addition, the legislative auditor recommended that we have a more clear accounting of how money is spent. It was pointed out that there were a couple of times that administrative expenses went over the statutory requirement, and so the second part of this amendment says on or before July 15th and annually thereafter, in any year that grant funds are available, the board shall provide a full accounting of its activities and achievements related to state grant funds to the chairs, again, of the ranking minority members of the Senate and House of Representatives. Madam President, it also, not in this amendment, but I would also point out to the members that the legislative auditor said that one of the most concerning things with regard to this program is the lack of consistent funding. And so while I appreciate Senator Tomassoni's including it in this bill, I'm hoping that in the future we can look at having this as a base appropriation so that we can send a signal to the film community that Minnesota is a serious competitor in this industry. But I'm pleased to offer the amendment to make sure we do have the kind of checks and balances and reporting requirements that the auditor recommended. With that, I stand for questions.
Senator Ortman.
Well, Madam President, I would ask if Senator Bonoff would yield.
Senator Bonoff will yield. Senator Ortman.
Madam President and Senator Bonoff, do you really think this is going to address the problems? This legislative auditor report was just issued in April. And I would say maybe it would be appropriate to ask for these corrections at this point, but the executive director of the Minnesota Film and TV Board said that she agreed that she did not take issue with the report's key findings and facts. She admitted to most of the problems with the reporting of the Film and TV Board. They were significant problems, and members, there will be a handout from the legislative auditor. In particular, they actually have failed to provide complete reports, accurate reports, and have presented potentially misleading reports. The productions that they have engaged in, for the most part, haven't been movies at all. Commercials, post-production only projects, or low-budget films. That's what they're doing with their current funds. It's not really a jobs program either, because the legislative auditor has said the productions provided work for an estimated 496 Minnesotans. But wait, there's more. Not just 496 Minnesotans, but they worked for 10 days or less on these projects. This is not an economic development program. It's a pet project of one of our senators who also has a tax bill on this to provide a new refundable tax credit to 20 projects, an estimated 20 projects. And so I appreciate what Senator Bonoff is attempting to do here. It's pretty hard to stomach another $10 million increase to this board in this biennium, but putting a few policy changes is not enough for me. And I would ask Senator Bonoff if maybe she would withdraw her amendment so we can go forward with an amendment that will repeal the $10 million out of this bill.
Senator Bonoff.
Madam President, I do not accept the request of Senator Ortman, and we previously had not been providing much funding to the film and TV credit, and so we did make a significant appropriation in the last biennium, and now they have began many features, and I would take exception to the characterization that the legislative auditor's report was as scathing as was said, because as I read the legislative auditor's report, I heard a program that has been fledgling because of lack of support. I heard some need for clear goals and objectives. I heard a need for consistent reporting, and like in my opinion, anytime we provide taxpayer funding, we ought to be clear about the outcomes we're looking for. And so this amendment is an attempt to go to the Film and TV Board and say, we support you, and we support you because we think it's very important for our community to be a place where arts thrive and where people who are in that community want to relocate and want to do business. And then we also want to be clear about what we expect from them. And so the language in the amendment actually lifts word for word the recommendations of the legislative auditor. And Madam President, I would yield to Senator Cohen.
Senator Cohen.
Madam President, members, Senator Ortman, what I took to be a somewhat pejorative comment, made a reference to a pet program of a particular senator. I believe she was referring to myself. This is not a pet program of mine. When I chaired the State Government Finance Division, I had jurisdiction over all the economic development monies and programs. And at some point, took a look at what actually produced money for the state in terms of monies that would have an immediacy relative to tax dollars and economic development dollars for the state of Minnesota, and what it would take to do that, and what kind of duration of time would it take to recognize that. And the film and television industry at its best in this state has been an economic development effort that has been highly successful. If, as Senator Bonoff pointed out, you actually read the legislative auditor's report, and I have, and in fact I've got it with me, what the report makes reference to over and over again is the failure of the legislature, and the failure of the legislature, and the failure of the legislature. And what they've talked about is the lack of consistency on the part of the state legislature. Now, some of that I've excused during a time of deficit. We're not in a time of deficit now. But what we had, Madam President, members, was an industry, if you go back to the halcyon days of the 90s, and to be fair, this is before you had these incentives being utilized around the country, you had Minnesota as, I think, the 4th or 5th largest production center in the country, with 5,000 or 6,000 full-time jobs, many of which were higher-paying union jobs, with the synergy of an industry that did not take much effort to create because of some of the natural things we had available in Minnesota. A significant and talented secondary acting pool, accessibility insofar as parts of the state. You could come into the Twin Cities and 20 minutes later be at a farm. You had significant crew support. That was lost during the deficit and recession years. This has been an effort to put this back together. Senator Ortman has talked about $10 million additional dollars. Senator Ortman is incorrect in that regard. I think the increase from the previous biennium to this biennium in Senator Tomassoni's bill is $3 million of one-time money. If we're going to be serious about this and not undercut it, as the legislative auditor suggests we have done, we need to put the effort into it to make it work. And if we do, we would produce the immediacy of economic development dollars. Ask the folks in northeastern Minnesota as to the impact. I haven't talked, I'm trying to think, Delano, I'm not sure if that's Senator Anderson or Senator Hutchinson. I haven't talked to Senator Anderson, but I've talked to the state representatives from that area who talked about the impact of the production of Simple Plan about 10, 12 years ago in the Delano area and the difference that made. And I should mention that I think in terms of, if we want to do stuff on a partisan basis, I think those legislators are, could be characterized as relatively conservative legislators in this building. So you've got the immediacy within a geography, you've got the ability potentially to put together a statewide industry. The other comment I'd make is I read a lot of legislative auditor reports over the years, and when they come in on some of the program analysis, I try to go through them as best I can, and I've had, I won't say a stack of them in the office, I go through them, try to synthesize what they have. I don't think I've seen an auditor's report that doesn't find, depending on the program, some need in terms of maybe restructuring how they handle grants, some corrections that they ought to make. And in this case, I would say, look at the gamut of auditor reports I've seen in terms of the criticisms directed toward the board operation, this would kind of fall into a lower third if you look at the continuity of legislative auditor reports.
Is there any more discussion on the 836 amendments? Senator Goodwin.
Thank you, Madam President. And I do appreciate Senator Bonoff trying to get some boundaries around the board. But I do have to say, too, that it's unfortunate that so many times we refund programs over and over again when we don't have any idea what the outcome was on them. And we don't ask them to come back with outcomes of how successful they were oftentimes, but we just keep refinancing them. And in the legislative auditor report here, it also says that we appropriated in 2014 to 2015, $10 million, which exceeded all previous funding for the program combined. 2014 and 2015, all previous. Now we're going 2 or 3 times that much to give them when we know the outcome. The outcome is not good for this board. And the legislative audit study particularly says the Minnesota Film and TV grant reports have been incomplete, inaccurate, and potentially misleading. That's a pretty damning statement, I would say. And that their administrative costs are too high. I think when we don't even have outcomes for a lot of programs, we don't have enough money around here to do things that we know are really important to Minnesotans, then we're rewarding one particular group for coming in with very poor outcomes, then that is a waste of taxpayers' money. And I don't think we should certainly not reward them by giving them more money when we've got a legislative audit report like this. And even with Senator Bonoff's amendment, I will vote for that because it's better than nothing. But we're asking them to come back and tell us what their outcomes ought to be and what their boundaries ought to be and so forth, rather than doing that ourselves, which is our job. So I think this money could be better spent in other places and certainly not rewarding a group that has basically not done a very good job at all. Thank you.
I think Senator Tomassoni was next, and then Senator Ortman. Senator Tomassoni. And would the people standing in front of Senator Tomassoni please move? Oh, you're letting Ortman go first? All right. Senator Ortman. I couldn't tell.
Madam President, I appreciate Senator Goodwin's comments because this is a budget bill. It's not a policy bill. I think we've already established it. This is a budget bill, and this is where the legislature says we are going to either fund or not fund programs, or in this case, we've been asked to increase the funding for a program that we know is failing and has very serious problems in reporting the truth to us about what they're doing with our money. If we don't step in a case like this, when will we ever step in? When we know they aren't using the money properly and they aren't reporting back the results. Why would we fund them to the extent we did last year, but why on earth would we give them even more money so they can continue with this misreporting? It's a nice try, Senator Bonoff, but it shouldn't fly with members in this chamber. It certainly won't with members of the public. And you can say this isn't a lot of money, but I completely disagree. There were a lot of great programs and a lot of great bills around here that haven't been funded. In fact, let me just remind you of the child care subsidies. There are all kinds of Minnesotans that are eligible and aren't getting funding. We just talked the other day about homeless veterans that don't have sufficient funding through the VA to establish stable housing. There are all kinds of problems around here. We don't need to give and spend more money after bad money. We need to be the check on this system. We need to make sure that this money is not being spent unwisely. We should not be supporting Senator Bonoff's amendment. But regardless, I assure you, I will come back with an amendment to take this money out.
On the A36 amendment, Senator Tomassoni.
Madam President, members, I support the A36 amendment. We had some discussion in finance last night about the auditor's report. I think the auditor's report has come out just a couple of weeks ago, and so reacting to it is maybe not as easy as we think, but this does, at first blush, does give a reaction that I think addresses a few of the issues that the auditor brings up. I think when you listen to what the board says about the discrepancies that were pointed out, they might be because of the different funds that the money came from and the different requirements on those funds. And so I think that it's important for us not to overreact to the auditor's report, and I think that this particular work of Senator Bonoff's is probably an appropriate reaction at this time.
Any more discussion on the A36 amendment? All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. Motion prevails. The amendment is adopted.
Madam President, I'd like to offer the A87.
Secretary will report the A87 amendment.
Senator Ortman moves to amend Senate File 2101 as follows, page 120, line 6, and this is the A87 amendment.
Senator Ortman.
Thank you, Madam President. As I promised, the A87 would take the funding from the Film and TV Board and redirect it to the Public Facilities Authority for wastewater infrastructure funding program grants for our communities that are in great need of funding to deal with the increased standards for wastewater treatment facilities. If each one were given a $250,000 grant, you could fund 40 cities with relief of $250,000. That's real property tax relief and a real cut in the cost to these communities that are really struggling to pay for these improvements. And I ask you to please look at the priorities here, because the Film and TV Board gets funding from two and now even a proposed third pot of funding from the legislature. We've got currently the appropriations that you see in this bill, which aren't just a base level, but an increase despite the legislative auditor's findings in a report. It's an increase. Plus, as I said, Senator Cohen, the only author on a Senate tax bill that was heard in committee this morning, asking for a new refundable tax credit for this same group of people, which would benefit 20 taxpayers. Members, I asked Senator Cohen about that bill, and I asked his testifiers about that bill. And I said, which one would be better? Should we fund the tax refund, or should we fund the direct appropriation? The testifiers said that the tax credits would be better for the industry. Please, members, remember what I just said. The experts and the testifiers said the tax refund would be a better incentive for film and TV production in the state of Minnesota. So why then are we going to add funding to the TV and Film Board through a direct appropriation, through a program that isn't working, when they are misrepresenting their results according to our legislative auditor? There are way more important and better uses for this funding, Madam President. And so I also asked Senator Cohen about his bill this morning, And I asked him, if you get funding for your tax credit, Senator, would you then repeal the 116 program that we have in Senator Tomassoni's bill? He said no, he wanted them both. And the legacy funding on top of it. Madam President, it would be a disgrace for this body to continue to fund and then increase the funding for this program when we know it is not working and we know that they are not being forthright in their results, and they're not getting good results. As I said, 496 people got jobs in this program, but they were hired for less than 10 days. This is an enormous amount of money that could actually help at least 40 cities build the wastewater treatment facilities that they are required by law to build, and it would provide the property tax relief, because if they don't get that funding, these cities are going to turn back to their residences and their businesses and ask them to pay a higher share for the cost of those improvements. Madam President, I ask for a roll call vote.
Roll call requested, roll call granted. Senator Cohen.
Madam President, Senator Ortman, you have misstated and misrepresented what I said in committee today. First of all, there was no discussion about the legacy amendment or legacy monies. That's not in the legacy bill.
Madam President, point of order.
State your point.
Madam President, you've admonished this body many times for speaking directly to a member, and right now I believe Senator Cohen is speaking in a fairly angry tone directly at a member.
Madam President, I said Madam President, Senator Ortman is what I said. Madam President,
Senator Cohen, please direct your comments to me.
Madam
Point well
President,
taken, Senator Thompson.
Madam President, Senator Ortman, you're misrepresenting what I said today in the tax committee. Number one, there was no discussion of the legacy amendment. During the time of deficit, there was money, some money placed in the legacy amendment. There was no money 2 years ago in the legacy amendment. There'll be no money this year in the legacy amendment. And there was no discussion, members, in the tax committee this morning relative to the legacy amendment. Second, what I said—
Madam President, I hope I'm given an opportunity
Senator Ortman,
to say
for what purpose does the
Madam
lady
President,
rise?
to clarify, I never said we discussed the legacy fund in the tax committee.
Senator Ortman, please wait until I call upon you. Thank you. I will call upon you. Senator Cohen, please continue.
Madam President, Senator Ortman has left the inference that there was discussion of the legacy amendment. It should be pointed out that there was no money 2 years ago in the legacy amendment. The only time there was money in the legacy amendment is when we were in deficit. In 2011, Senator Ingebrigtsen had some money in the legacy amendment. Again, we were in significant deficit with $6 billion. This is an economic development program. It should not be in the legacy amendment. Second, I made it clear that I was not looking to pass money in both bills. And it was pointed out at the tax committee this morning by the chairman of the tax committee, Senator Skoye, that it's not uncommon that members might try a dual track, that they might make an effort to, depending on what's going on, try a tax credit, try something else in the tax committee, try something else in the budget committee. Members should also understand that the tax committee didn't pass the bill. The bill was laid over in the tax committee. So the only thing active in the state Senate is Senator Tomassoni's bill. Next, relative to, did I suggest that I would support repeal of this section? I said no, because there's no guarantee that anything passes out of the tax committee. Again, I repeat myself, the tax committee, and I think, glancing around the floor, I think other members who were there would agree that the tax committee took no action on this, laid it over. In fact, I've been told by Senator Skoye that it's highly unlikely that the tax committee is going to pass the bill and fund it this year. Now, Senator Skoye's not on the bill, so he can't confirm that, but that was in our conversation. Senator Skoye said, as a matter of courtesy, he wanted to give me a hearing on the bill to make sure that the issue was presented to the tax committee in case there was any interest. I don't serve on the tax committee. But as we discussed relative to Senator Bonoff's amendment, this is a program that in the past worked as a significant economic development program for the state of Minnesota. Senator Ortman has talked about the legislative auditor's report, and she's distributed the front page, and I would just point out, I'm assuming this is Senator Ortman's underlining and circling, the legislature has not been clear about its expectations of the board. As I pointed out earlier, the legislature has not been clear. Second, most of the productions that the board approved were commercials, post-production, low-budget films. that's the nature of the work. There's all sorts of film, television, other kinds of production work. That's the way the business works. Second, talks about, I'm not sure other pages were included, but I think if you look at Senator Ortman's, what she's copied and presented to the floor, you'll find significant discussion about legislative inadequacy, not film board inadequacy. It talks about, again, I'm looking at the things she circled that I'm assuming would maintain her argument, or she would suppose would maintain her argument. When Legacy Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund supported the Film Production Jobs Program, it talked about the board exceeded the administrative expenses allowed by law. That gets into the legislature bouncing this thing around. The board staff, which is a small staff, has attempted to comply. And again, there were certainly problems with the legacy funding. Again, it was done as kind of a forced measure as a consequence of the deficit. I can only go back to where the board was X number of years ago when we had an industry that was growing 5,000 to 6,000 full-time folks in the state of Minnesota, significant economic development, more so than you usually find with what we try to do. And it's coupled, members, with the fact that if we want this kind of an industry in the state, you need this kind of a board. Folks are not going to look at Minnesota absent the existence of such a board. Should also point out, and the legislative auditor noted this, 49 states and several of the territories have such boards. I'm not sure what the exception to the rule is, but we would be the other outlier if Senator Ortman's amendment passes. The other thing I should mention is that the increase, because there's, if you look at Senator Ortman's note, why would we increase their funding by almost 5 times? The increase in Senator Tomassoni's bill, ask Senator Tomassoni, is from $10 million for the biennium to $13 million to the biennium. Let's see, Senator Ortman's the former tax chairman. I'm the current finance chairman. Both of us know that 10 to 13 is not 5 times. So, members, if you want to try to get this going and try to recreate an economic development program that was producing more for the state of Minnesota than most other economic development programs do, that has more spin-off, more direct tax dollars coming into the state when the program is running effectively. And my last comment, Madam President and members, is the reference to 496 Minnesotans work for 10 days or less. Of course, the program was just beginning. The program is just beginning. This referenced, I believe, the first 10 months of the incentive. Right now, the Film Board, depending on what we do this year, is in the process of announcing, I believe, 2 moderate-sized features in northeastern Minnesota, a more major production in St. Paul, and I believe an HBO series in the city of Stillwater. Those are relatively major investments in the state of Minnesota, and would expect that the impact on those local economies will be significant. We know that for a fact. That's what's happened. And that there will be tax dollars produced for the state of Minnesota to more than compensate for the public dollars spent.
Senator Ortman.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm glad that Senator Cohen has corrected his claim about misrepresentation. The 3 different pots of money that have been proposed for this program are first, the legacy funds, which we previously used to fund this program. Now we have a direct appropriation through economic development, but remember, it's not working as an economic development program. If you think 496 Minnesotans working less than 10 days is an economic development program, I'm telling you, I think you're wrong. And then the third one is the proposed tax credit. But even if we focused on the tax credit, we wouldn't be as competitive as we should be if we really want to be in this industry. Because the states that are truly competitive with these credits are the ones that offer transferable credits. where the taxpayer can sell the tax credit. That's what we heard in the tax committee today. It's not the rebate program that we're proposing to increase funding for today. It's not even the tax credit that's proposed in the tax committee today. None of those would make Minnesota competitive with those states that are truly successful in bringing the film industry into their state with these incentive programs. Madam President, we have better uses for these funds, and I hope members will agree.
Is there any more discussion? Senator Tomassoni.
Madam President, members, I oppose the Ortman amendment. The actual fact of the matter is that Senator Cohen's right when he says that the return on the dollar is very significant in this program, and in fact, they just contacted, I believe it is with Paramount, who hasn't been back to the state for quite a while, and the reason that they haven't been here is because of the lack of continuity in our programs, and this one is going to cost them $1.5 million just to get them back here. So there's a significant drain on the fund, and I believe that when we do one of the things that I think the legislative auditor said, and that is to provide some consistency in funding, that this particular bill does that and shows that we're serious about getting films to come here and generate the return on economic development. So I oppose the Ortman amendment.
Senator Thompson. Sorry.
Thank you, Madam President and members. I stand to support the Ortman amendment, and I would respectfully disagree with Senator Cohen's assertion that the legislative auditor's report admonished the legislature and not the film board. There's a comment in there, I think I have it, I'm not reading it, I think I'm accurately portraying it as saying that their information was incomplete, inaccurate, and potentially misleading. That combined with the other criticisms that Senator Ortman has pointed out and that are contained in here, I think really call into question the value of what this organization is doing. So really, to me, this is a fairly simple vote, members. This is about, are we going to pour more money into an organization that has gotten a not particularly good review in doing what it was supposed to have done, even though apparently the information wasn't reported accurately from the film board? Or are we going to choose to use that money, as Senator Ortman has suggested, for basic infrastructure needs of the citizens of the state of Minnesota? That's what this amendment boils down to. I respectfully urge members to vote yes.
Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Madam President. And I just have a comment. Yesterday during the during the meeting, members and Madam President, we talked about this at some length with regards to the questions and concerns that Senator Goodwin had brought forward about the OLA, and Senator Ortman has that attached here. And after listening to Senator Cohen's comments, yes, we have in fact funded the film board, I believe, to the tune of $1 million from legacy funding. And quite frankly, folks, our citizens understand that kind of money coming out of legacy. They think that's a great place for it. They think that's what this has gone towards when you start talking about arts and humanities and the such. And that's why we did put some dollars in that. In fact, we had a very good discussion with the House and Senate combination legacy funding committee some years ago, where they actually came in and gave a pretty good production, and they did note how we potentially could be losing some dollars here if we don't start moving in that direction. So those funds were actually appropriated, and unfortunately here was the outcome. Administratively, it doesn't seem to be working out. So I have the tendency to agree with Senator Ortman with regards to, do we need to get this cleaned up before we start expending dollars? It seems very clear that we should, members. I do have some experience, of course, on the Lessard-Sams Outdoor Heritage, which has been audited by this same OLA 2 or 3 different times over the years, and we've came up with a absolute clean bill of health, and actually our administrative costs have actually gone down in its second biennium. So there are some functionality problems going on here with the administrative side of these programs, and frankly, it would seem sensible that we get that in order before we start expending dollars. And of course, now where the dollars are being asked to go by Senator Ortman's amendment is certainly a great place with some of these infrastructures in these smaller towns in rural Minnesota now basically coming due for some repair, and this would be money that would be very much appreciated and well served. So I stand in support of Senator Ortman's amendment.
Is there any more discussion on the A87 amendment? Senator Westrom.
Madam President, members, look at this amendment. I think Senator Ortman is on to something here. $10 million that could be spread to 40 or more communities that we represent. I think this is a clever and a better use of funds for our cities for core infrastructure, water, sewer projects that our communities try to keep up with the MPCA and the EPA regulations. You've heard some discussion about that on the floor. You've heard some of the groups in our cities and mayors and local elected officials and city maintenance men and women talking to us about the cost and the trouble they have to keep up with compliance of the MPCA and the regulations that keep coming down on them as they try to provide good, safe drinking water to our communities and proper infrastructure for sewer and disposal. Members, this could be grants to 40 communities or more throughout rural Minnesota, throughout the metro cities that need it. And so, members, think long and hard. This would make much better use of the dollars in our communities that are struggling to find these kinds of dollars for projects that oftentimes we as a state government through an agency MPCA or the federal government impose on them. These are unfunded mandates that they're trying to deal with, and this would help them out with those types of unfunded mandates. I would urge a green vote, and this would be a better use of $10 million in this bill.
Senator Bonoff.
Thank you, Madam President. We on the Senate floor have discussions and go back and forth with regard to organizations that don't have the opportunity to refute what we say, and so I have before me a copy of what the Film and TV Board said in response to one of the findings in the Legislative Auditor's report. And because I know that everyone values their reputation, I want to be their voice just in response to one particular point. So Ms. Winter, who is the director of the Film and TV Board, did say that with regard to the findings around the exceeding the 5% cap, that in 2012, when legacy funds supported Snowbait, the board stayed within the admin budget approved by the Office of Grants Management, but exceeded the 5% cap for administration expenses called out in the Snowbait Statute 116U.26. So basically, what Ms. Winter said is that this is the only time the auditor found they were outside compliance, and that was when they were using the guidelines in the legacy funds rather than our Snowbait statute. They have since corrected that and have expressed a strong commitment to compliance. The other thing I just wanted to mention is with regard to the map that Senator Ortman put forward, I think one can conclude that there is a lot of activity around trying to attract and retain these production films, because states do understand that it is a wonderful source of economic activity. And so we can discuss whether or not it's best to be in the tax bill or the finance bill, and if at the end of the day it ends up in the tax bill, then that would certainly be fine. But I think the main conclusion I would draw from looking at the map is that states are clamoring to compete in this arena. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Westrom.
Madam President, one additional follow-up for members to consider. 2 years ago, when we had this discussion in front of committee, the question came up about where are these dollars going to be spent? Where's the filming going to happen? And the truth of the matter is it's going to happen mostly right here in the metro area. So rural members, don't be lulled into thinking Roseau or Thief River Falls or Wilmer or Maynard are going to get these snowbait dollars or the film dollars, because their answer to us in committee then was, it's too far out there to travel. We don't think you have enough hotels and infrastructure, and it's just more cost for us. And so they are not going to travel to the far parts of the state. In fact, not that very far at all. Members, it's interesting. I have Herman right near the middle of my Senate district. Herman, if any of you have recall hearing that, that is the bachelor capital of our state, maybe the country. Herman, USA was a movie made about this bachelor mania in Herman in the 1990s. Well, folks, where the film Herman was filmed was not in Herman, Minnesota, for that exact reason. And so these dollars aren't going to travel to rural Minnesota. In fact, Herman, USA, the movie, was filmed in New Germany, from what I recall. They actually had to redo the water tower to make it look like Herman, Minnesota. And so, members, when they won't even come out to film the town Herman in the movie of Herman, USA, don't be believing you're going to get these dollars coming out to rural Minnesota. They're going to stay in the metro area. These grants that Senator Ortman have put forward to help our cities with water and sewer infrastructure would be a much better use and spread across the state a lot better.
Any final discussion on the A87 amendment? Seeing none, the Secretary will take the roll. All members having voted, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 28 ayes and 33 noes, the motion does not prevail. The amendment is not adopted. Are there any other amendments? Senator Gazelka.
Madam President, I have the A80 amendment.
Senator Gazelka, was that the A18?
80.
A80. A80 amendment. The Secretary will report the amendment.
Senator Gazelka moves to amend Senate File Number 2101 as follows, page 120, line 6, and this is the A80 amendment.
Senator Gazelka.
Madam President, members, this is not much different than the amendment that was just defeated, except where the dollars go to. So it is taking dollars from the Minnesota Film Board and moving them into the broadband category that presently is 17 million. This would increase that to 27 million. Senator Schmidt traveled around the state, rural Minnesota, doing listening sessions and hearing what groups said around the state. He came to a couple of areas in my area, and I had a chance to drop in there. And this issue in times past was not the number one issue. It wasn't the number 2 issue or the number 3 issue. It was way down on the list for folks in rural Minnesota. But as time has progressed the last couple of years, for most groups out in rural Minnesota, this has become the number 1 issue for future development. So if we're talking about economic development and what's good for the state, putting more money towards developing broadband in rural Minnesota is critical. Without broadband, what happens is rural hospitals can't provide the care that they want to provide. They don't have the technology to do that. Without broadband, your local schools do not have the capability to have all the resources available that the students deserve and get in places that they do have broadband. Without broadband, businesses don't want to expand or start in rural Minnesota. And so this is absolutely critical. And I'll say that Senator Schmidt had $100 million in his bill for broadband. This only moves it to $27 million. So, Madam President, members, if you think that broadband is important in rural Minnesota, this is an opportunity to vote where your conscience is, vote where you see the need. Madam President, I do want a roll call on this. I think it's critical that we see where people are at on broadband and whether it's important to them. Thank you.
Is there any discussion on the A80 amendment? Sorry.
Madam President.
Senator Tomassoni.
Madam President, you know, we know how important it is to fund broadband, but quite frankly, there's probably not enough money in this capital to fund all the needs of broadband. And if we go too fast on this, quite frankly, we may find ourselves putting all kinds of money into a technology that in a couple of years gets outdated, or there's another one for it. We know there's a big need, and we know that it's important, but I think for right now we have two different funds that are using the money here, and I know for sure that we're experiencing really impressive economic returns on the fund from the snow bait, and I know that as broadband continues, that we will continue to fund that, and we will find more money for it. In fact, the actual need for broadband is probably more in the $1 billion range than it is in the $27 million range. And so I'd like to keep the bill in its current form.
Senator Gazelka.
Well, Madam President, Senator Tomassoni, to say that the technology may change or that there's a $1 billion need, and then to say that we're not going to give you anything or virtually anything is remarkable. It's easy to say when you have broadband in your area. I have broadband where I live, but certainly part of the district I represent, District 9, has no broadband. And so you're happy to have old technology instead of no technology. And so we got to start putting our money where our mouth, or our money where our mouth is.
Senator Schmidt.
Thank you, Madam President. I would just like to echo the points that Senator Gazelka raised. In round one, our broadband fund has been tremendously successful. We're going to have construction projects this summer that will extend the reach of high-speed internet to over 6,000 homes in Minnesota, hundreds of businesses, and over 80 anchor institutions, public libraries, hospitals. We've seen the need out there. If you look at the papers around the state, there's tremendous support for what we've done. I'm very thankful for this body and for what we accomplished last year with the House and the Governor in starting this program, funding it at the $20 million level. I think it's incredibly important for us to build off of that momentum this year. We're at $17 million in this bill. I know it's an incredibly competitive environment. However, I think it's important for us to build on that effort to inspire another round of competitive applications coming forward. And I'm convinced that this is going to be money well spent for the state of Minnesota and for our rural communities. This is a very difficult vote for members because I understand that folks do support the film board, but I do think it's important for us to recognize both the need for broadband infrastructure investment. The governor's task force on broadband recommended $200 million devoted to infrastructure investments in this area in this biennium. That task force also recommended and recognized that in order to meet our state speed goals, minimum 5 megabits per second upload, 10 megabits per second download in 2015, it could cost over $1 billion. The state's not possibly going to be able to do that alone, but it's important for us, as Senator Gazelka mentioned, to put our money where our mouth is. And frankly, I don't think $17 million is going to cut it. Thank you.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Madam President. Will Senator Schmidt yield?
Senator Schmidt will yield. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Schmidt, I think we all realize how important broadband is. Our lives, livelihood, commerce rides on that. My question is, can you tell me if your broadband initiative that this Senate amendment would add more funding to, does this broadband initiative include the last mile, in other words, serving the unserved, or does your broadband initiative actually replace what is already being provided in the private sector, or does it lead to, or does it enable in any way publicly owned or municipal owned broadband, or in other words, taxpayer funded broadband services instead of what is currently privately funded?
Senator Schmidt.
Thank you, Madam President. In the first round, we had tremendous success, and what we tried to do with our policy language is to encourage partnerships. It's so easy to look at this issue in terms of public versus private. I think the way to maximize the return on any state or tax dollars is to promote partnerships, and that's what we're focusing on. And with this grant fund, I can assure you that we're focusing first and foremost on the hardest to reach areas, those areas in the state that are falling short of our state speed goals of 5 by 10 service. But it's important for us also to recognize the great economic development potential of broadband investment. So the policy language has not changed from round 1 to round 2. All we're simply talking about right here is putting our money where our mouth is and increasing the funding for the broadband fund.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Madam President, and Senator Schmidt. So while I support extensive broadband, I'm still not clear from your answer if in fact public dollars would be used to replace privately funded and private broadband services. So that does remain a concern of mine. I will look further into your bill, but your answer did not actually give enough clarity on that. And my thought is that if you're saying that we don't have enough money, then of course it would make sense that the priority be at those areas which do not have broadband service. And so that would be my encouragement.
Senator Ortman.
Madam President, I'm grateful for Senator Gazelka's amendment because he has identified a need for the state, a critical need. People are wondering, why are folks leaving the rural areas of Minnesota to live in the Twin Cities? Well, this is one of them, because they can't have access to the internet. This is pretty clear. It's a need, where the film board and TV board, that's a want. Let's fund the needs first and get to the wants later. Members, we have a lot of new folks. This is their second budget. I remember my second budget when I served in the Senate a few years ago. And in my second budget, I at one point went along with the majority who was supporting a governor initiative, an energy bill. And I was told at the time, well, the governor supports it. It's a good bill, Senator Wortman, and I voted yes. It's the only vote I've regretted because I didn't do my own work and I didn't come to my own conclusion. And I'm asking members here who are now on their second budget, not their first budget, to think through this a little bit. Are you going to fund a program that isn't working, that's a want, versus a program that is a critical need for the state of Minnesota? You have leaders that are chairmen, chairwomen, and you have majority leaders that are saying go along with the budget, but you don't have to. This vote counts for an awful lot of Minnesotans who need your help and support with this amendment.
Senator Gazelka.
Thank you, Madam President. Closing comments. We talk about a one Minnesota. This is a key issue for rural Minnesota. And this is something that we actually can do that makes a difference. It's a lot like rural electric in days of old. There's no way the private sector could do it. That's where the government actually had to help get electricity out to rural Minnesota. This is that next issue, and I'd appreciate your support.